Hi, this is Webinar 3, which is called Making the Application. First of all, I want to have an introduction and disclaimer. I need to start with a short disclaimer that these talks are entirely for information purposes only. They are not intended as advice. I will not accept liability for any work you undertake. Such work must be at your risk. I have met many people who jibe at the quotes they receive from solicitors and want a bit more information about the forms and the process. I've looked at lots of websites, and it seems to me that while some of them are really quite good, they all require you to sit down and work your way through a lot of material, some of it quite technical and not easy to absorb. This webinar and the two previous ones are only meant as tools to help you do the job or understand it, but they are not an instruction manual. By their very nature, these webinars are basic. If you have questions, then you will have to do some research. For that, I would refer you in particular to the to the HMRC booklet IHT 206, notes to help you fill in the IHT 205, which you will find online. Just briefly to explain these initials, which I'll be using a lot, HMRC stands for HM Revenue and Customs. IHT stands for Inheritance Tax, but I will try to use the full names as much as possible, as initials can be confusing. In these webinars, I'm only trying to explain and clarify the process involved, so that if you do undertake applying for probate yourself, you have some idea of what you are taking on. So now a bit about myself. My name is Andy Littlefield. I'm legally qualified, though I work only as a specialist in wills, powers of attorney, and probate. I have experience in conveyancing, but I no longer work in that field. Previous webinars. This webinar is headed Making the Application. It is the third of 3 webinars. First one is about the legal background. The second one is about preparing for the application, the sort of information you will need to fill out the forms, and how to go about getting that information. And the third one, this one, is about how to fill those forms in. Now, if you're anything like me, you will simply want to get on with filling out the forms. However, if you are intended to make the application yourself without using a solicitor or probate specialist, I would urge you to look at all 3 talks. Applying for probate is a legal process. You learn in the first talk why it is important that you need certain information and what is going to be done with it. The second talk is about how to get that information and who to approach for it. It helps to save time when sitting down to fill out these forms, which I'll come to shortly. The background to these webinars, personal qualities. Having got that off my chest, I must clarify that these webinars are intended for 2 types. Those who want to explore the possibility of applying for probate themselves and saving on the legal costs, and those who are quite happy to leave the legal process to their legal advisors, but want to know what they, the legal advisors, are doing to justify their costs. If you want to do it yourself, my instinct is always to say, go ahead, but be realistic. It's not for everyone. I can give you 2 examples of what I mean from my personal experience. The first one concerned a friend who was the executor of her father's estate. The father had been very wealthy, and the daughter, who was, still is, a strong and very competent character, decided to handle the estate herself. However, the family beneficiaries were only concerned with when they got their money, and pressurized her to the extent that it almost broke her health. In the end, she went to a solicitor. The first thing he did was write to the beneficiaries, reminding them that his costs were £300 an hour, and every time they rang, it would cost the estate X pounds. The phone calls stopped overnight. On the other hand, I know 2 other people who also dealt with their parents' estates, both of which were considerable, and they did so with no problem. But in both those cases, there was no pressure from their respective families. The qualities you need are to be careful and methodical. You must keep careful records, accurate records. You should not be tempted to take shortcuts or put down incorrect information to save time. Perhaps most importantly, there should not be tensions within the various beneficiaries, which can only lead to arguments. If there is any element of disagreement between the beneficiaries, it is best to have a third party doing the application for you. The estates. I will make the point several times in this talk that these webinars are for straightforward estates, by which I mean estates which are not liable to inheritance tax and which do not involve complex trusts. You can, of course, still apply for probate yourself if you want to, but if there is tax to pay or there are trusts involved, you will need to do more research. They are both complex subjects, and you may be better off going to someone who specializes in those subjects and accept the costs involved, rather than try to muddle along on your own. So, ask yourself the following questions. Did the deceased own foreign property? Did the deceased make gifts to charity in his will? Did the deceased make gifts during his lifetime? Did the deceased retain benefit from property which he had given away during his lifetime? An example of this would be that he gave his house to his children but continued to live in it. Did the deceased get benefit from a trust, or did he hold property on trust for someone else? And finally, is inheritance tax payable? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, my suggestion is to seek legal advice. Some of these issues are complex and you need to be careful. Do I need a grant at all? There is a lot of confusion about probate. One question I hear a lot is, if I have a will, does that do away with the need for probate? I also hear the opposite question, if he or she hasn't made a will, does that do away with the need for probate? The answer is that you nearly always need probate. There is only one very limited exception, where the estate is less than £5,000 and the bank or financial institution is willing to take part. Otherwise, you need a grant. And just to be clear, if you have land or shares, you will definitely need a grant, no matter how small the estate is. You should be aware that there are two types of grants. Grant of probate, where there is a will, and grant of letters of administration, where there isn't. That's called intestacy. But for the purposes of this webinar, I'm referring only to grants of probate, as the procedure and forms are the same. The basic procedure, and I've got reference to this on the screen there. If you apply yourself without going to a lawyer, then the documents that you will need to send to the probate registry are the probate application form, the PA1, the appropriate IHT form, depending on whether tax is payable or not. I'm dealing with this later in the webinar. The form IHT 217, which I'll come to again shortly, but it applies where you are claiming a spouse's nil rate band. You need an official copy of the death certificate, the original will and 3 copies, and the probate fee. Now, as I said, I'm dealing with documents 1, 2, and 3 in more detail shortly in this webinar, but regarding the other forms, death certificate, you need an original copy. The probate registry will not accept a photocopy, even a certified one. For this reason, it is advisable to get several copies ordered when you register the death. I would normally recommend getting 10 copies. Will. The probate registry wants the original will plus 3 copies. Just one word of caution, please do not take the original will apart in an effort to get a clean copy. If the registry believe that the original has been tampered with, even with the best of motives, they will require extra evidence that the will has not been altered, and this can only cause delay. Probate fee. This is a standard fee of £215, 215, plus 50p for each extra copy. Personally, I don't think you can lose by ordering a number of extra copies, and I normally recommend getting 10 copies, which after all is only an extra £5. Each account holder you write to for money will want or need an official copy of the grant, and you will save time by having a copy to send to them. Account holders normally will not accept a photocopy. The copies you get from the probate registry, they're called official copies, are clearly identifiable as such, as they are embossed with the court seal. So before I get on to the forms, I need to touch on the subject of inheritance tax. The first issue you need to decide on in proceeding with your application is on the appropriate inheritance tax form to complete. For this, you need to know the value of the estate, and I have explained in Webinar 2 how to go about getting that information together. This is a complicated issue and cannot be dealt with easily in a short webinar. The purpose of this section of the webinar is just to help you understand what's required. I'm sorry to stress this point, but if you're not sure of the position, you must seek professional advice. So I'm going to start with the basic procedure and then go on to calculate whether you are liable for inheritance tax or not. So the procedure is important as it's different depending on whether you have to pay inheritance tax or not. If inheritance tax is payable, then you have to complete the Inland Revenue Form, IHT 400. This is an intimidating form of 16 pages and 21 schedules. The guidance notes from HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, comes to 92 pages. People are often surprised at the amount of information required. The important point here, though, is that if tax is paid, HMRC will require it to be paid before the grant of probate can be issued. If there is sufficient money in the deceased's accounts, then there is a procedure for the executors to get this released direct to HMRC. But failing this, the executors may have to borrow the money. Once HMRC have received the money, they will inform the probate registry, who can then issue the grant of probate. The tax must be paid within 6 months, failing which interest is chargeable. This webinar is not designed for that type of procedure. This is not to say that you can't proceed with the application. As I said earlier, I know of 2 people who did exactly that. But if you're not confident about the process, please go to a specialist. If inheritance tax is not payable, then the appropriate form is the IHT 205.